this week's program, International Women's Day stories continue with domestic violence widespread in Sri Lanka, Talibanization of Pakistan threatens women's rights further, report on women empowerment in conflict zones, widow of Filipino massacre speaks out. Also, in this episode, 10th anniversary of Sumchai's disappearance in Thailand, extrajudicial killings in broad daylight in Bangladesh, voice of survivors this week, also from Bangladesh. Welcome to Human Rights Asia Weekly Roundup. I'm Hanan Shinelli. As International Women's Day was celebrated around the world last Saturday, we continue our stories about women in Asia. We start with the underreported but widespread issue of domestic violence in Sri Lanka.
මූණ පිට ඊට පස්සේ වතුරයක් ගෙන ලක් කරලා ගියේ සාර රෝදට ඒ හන්දියේ ගෙන් ඇවිල්ලා වෙනත් මහත්තයෙන් ක්‍රීම් මේක ගෙන් දාවා
නිකම්මද කියලා තිබ්බේ නේද මොන හරි දාලාද කියලා තිබ්බේ ලාම්පුව දාලා අරගෙන හිටියේ නිදි ගිහිල්ලා නිදි ලාම්පුව දාලා
නිදා හිටියේ ඒ උදේ මේ නැගිටලා මට තේරි පෙරියන්නේ කිව්වේ හතර විතර කලන් තින්න නැගිටින්න බැරින්ද බුදියන් හිටියා ඊට පස්සේ කොහොමහරකින් බනලා මේ කිව්වා තේව කරපක් කියලා මං කිව්වා මට නැගිටින්න බැහැ ඊට පස්සේ ලාම්පුව දාලා ගෙනිදාලා දාලා
Sunita Sandamale died in agony almost 2 weeks after she was set on fire by her husband, who was part of a paramilitary group. He was acquitted due to lack of evidence. Reports of sexual and domestic violence are repeated from women from all parts of Sri Lanka daily. Women's groups have been campaigning for protection and redress. However, there is no response at all from the government. Not a single leader in the government, including the president, takes any notice of any of these complaints. To make matters worse, resorting to the police to get their complaints investigated is a futile exercise and tends to only add to the problems for the women.
මගේ නම මල්දුගුරි අනුෂා සුදර්ශිනී මට දරුවන් 4 දෙනෙක් ඉන්නවා මම විවාහ වුණේ 2000 අවුරුද්දේ මට දායින්දම් ඉතින් මගේ ස්වාමියා මානසික පහර දෙනවා ගහනවා එක සැරයක් මේ ගහන දෙක මෙතන මහුම් 7ක් දාන්න රෝහල් පොලිසියට කට උත්තර දුන්නා එතනින් ගිහුවා කිසිම පොලිසියෙන් කිසිම පියවරක් ගත්තේ නැහැ
මම බැඳපු මගේ මහත්තයා මට දිගින් දිගටම කරදර කරනවා ගහනවා අධිහිංසා කරනවා ඊට පස්සේ මම පොලිසියට ගිහිල්ලා පැමිණිලි කරන් පස්සේදී පොලිසිය මට සාධාරණයක් ඉෂ්ට කරන්නේ මගේ පිටම වරද පටවලා සාම්පෝෂයත් එක්ක යන්න කියලා මට තර්ජනය කරනවා
The Domestic Violence Act is a good step, but the problem prevails in the attitudes about domestic violence. The almost all of the temples, churches and kovils think that women and children are subordinate to men. This attitude prevails in the police and the courts and the majority of people. They want to protect the marriage life, but they don't care about domestic violence. They don't care about violation of rights of women and children. This is the situation in Sri Lanka.
In Pakistan, negotiations with the Taliban threaten to destroy what little freedoms remain for women in the country. In a country that already has a repressive attitude towards women and in which a woman's worth is considered to be only half that of a man, the government's peace negotiations with the Taliban include demands to further erode women's rights. There is concern that the policy of appeasement towards the Taliban will drastically affect women in Pakistan, such as their right to work, to go to school, to move around freely, and demands that they cover themselves with the full burqa. Physical and sexual violence, honor killings, forced marriages, and structural inequalities within society make Pakistan one of the worst countries to be a woman. In some areas, illegal courts known as jirgas send young women and even minor girls to be traded off as settlement of feuds. Pakistan is constantly rated close to the bottom of any global gender gap index. Women have few things to celebrate on this International Women's Day, as negotiations with the Taliban threaten to destroy what little freedoms remain. But it's not all bad news for women in Asia. With us in the studio now, we have Anjuman Begum to talk about some of the surprising ways women can become empowered. Welcome, Anjuman. You have researched women in conflict and post-conflict situations. What are your findings in relation to women's roles in those situations?
The situation of women doesn't change even if there is a conflict. I mean, the gender discrimination remains the same. But what happens is that since they are considered as very insignificant, they have more wider space for movement. So what often we see is that in conflict situation, the women movement or their mobility increased, and also it gives them a scope to become leaders. So women participate in a conflict as combatants, as peace negotiators, as human rights activists. And but what happens is that they are mostly in the visible part, like they are as a victim. Whenever there's a report on a conflict situation, you'll see that women coming up, crying. Most of the time the portrayal is just, their victimhood. But they have the potential of being in the formal decision making, like to take part in the peace negotiation, to express what they have suffered, or to come up, to contribute in the peace process. But this is where their participation is very, very low. Like in a study by UN Women, out of prominent 61 peace negotiations in the world, only 2 peace negotiations has women as signatory. So I think the women's leadership is completely neglected in peace and security issues. It's only their victimhood which is prominent.
What does that mean in terms of possible future campaigns for women's rights?
I can see there are 2 possibilities, like the International Women's Conventions, which is called CEDAW. It has come up with a very pragmatic and very, a kind of very important general recommendation. It's number 30. It talks about women's participation and also talks about certain international resolutions adopted by Security Council, which talk that women's leadership should be ensured in the formal decision-making powers and also in the peacemaking or peace agreements. They should be there as leaders and taking part in the formal, table of negotiation. So, and also there is a discussion about the MGDs. All this resolution is coming to an end in 2015, and what happened after that? It's called a post-2015 agenda. And women's groups are lobbying with these discussions to bring forth the women's leadership in peace and security issues. I think these are really important areas for women activists to campaign for.
In November 2009, the Philippines experienced one of the worst massacres in recent history. 58 people were slaughtered in a political dispute in Maguindanao on Mindanao, most of them journalists. We talked to Myrna Reblando, who became a widow that day and was forced to leave her country as a result of the murder of her husband.
It's a really big challenge for me to accept the fact that my husband was brutally killed by a big politician that allied by our former president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. So as an ordinary mother and wife of a journalist, and sometimes it's hard for me to be articulate in everything, especially talking my second language like English. Because I got married at 16 years old, and I did not have any degree at all. I am a person that don't want any trouble. I just want to take care of my family. So being a human rights defender is not very easy for me, because I start to fight without knowing how to do it. But I have to be brave, because I am the mother of my children. So I had to be back in composure, just to fight and to have to face those challenges, to file a case against those perpetrators.
On March 12, it was 10 years since Thai human rights lawyer Somchai Nilapajit disappeared from the streets of Bangkok. Somchai often provided legal assistance to Muslims in the south of Thailand who had been tortured and illegally detained, often accused of terrorist activities. This made him unpopular with Thailand's military forces who controlled the area. Ever since Somchai was abducted, his widow Ankana has waged a tireless fight to hold those responsible to account and find justice for her husband. Here is Ankana on the 10th anniversary of her husband's disappearance.
10 years past that, one thing that I can say that is quite successful is about rights to access to livings. On 2012, the Thai government agreed to compensate the families of victims of enforced disappearance in southern Thailand. But it's only in southern Thailand. It's not overall the country. Anyway, I think that my work will still continue to ask the Thai government to concern more the victims of enforced disappearance, because for the families of the victims of enforced disappearance, their emotion will be up and down. They remain grievance in their heart. Nobody can understand them, because for this appearance, we have no body of the victims. It looks like the murder with absence of body. You haven't had the graveyard to remember of your loved one. So I think it's really traumatizing for the victims. On 9 of January 2012, the Thai government signed the Convention on Involuntary Disappearance, the UN Convention. And the government said that they will ratify the convention within the year 2014. So I think that if the Thai government ratifies the convention, so they will have a good mechanism to protect and prevent enforced disappearance in Thailand. By the way, the victim can access to truth and justice, and especially for women.
Extrajudicial murders have claimed 2 more lives in Bangladesh capital city, Dhaka. The country's paramilitary force, the Rapid Action Battalion, RAB, has killed 2 persons at Jurain area under Amtoli police station at around 12:15 a.m. on March 3rd. The victims were identified as 50-year-old Mohammed Wasim and Sangram Chowdhury, aged 45. The RAB claims that these 2 persons died in a so-called gunfight while they were rescuing some kidnapped victim who was supposedly held in the house. Sonia Akhtar, wife of Mohammed Wasim, rejected the RAB's official version. She told the media that her husband had leased to collect toll from Pastagola Bridge. The RAB raided their house and picked up Wasim from his office. Sonia pleaded with the RAB members not to kill her husband. She told them that she is 7 months pregnant and her future child should not be an orphan before birth. She even held onto the leg of one of the RAB officers to beg for her husband's life. She told them to prosecute Wasim if he had broken any laws. All her pleadings were not enough to save her husband's life. The RAB members killed Wasim in front of his pregnant wife. Wasim's colleague, Sangram Chowdhury, tried to escape by climbing down the water pipes of the building, but the RAB caught him and shot him dead too. Human rights experts have observed that the ruling regime systematically used law enforcement agency as hired gunmen to silence the opposition with blatant impunity and in broad daylight. In this week's Voices of Survivors, we hear from Shahid Kayas from Bangladesh, who narrowly escaped being killed by state agents. Here is his story.
When I was going to the island, Mayadip and Nunetek, where we were working for the 12,000 people's livelihood to save their life and livelihood and others. So in the middle of the river, it's called Meghna River, I was kidnapped by some people. So along with me, one volunteer from New York University, Chris Pinderhughes, was there. And they also tried to take him out also. Somehow I had some debate with those people, and I just convinced them not to take him along with me. They started beating me. Physically, they harassed a lot, and they chopped on my wrist of my left hand and on my neck, and they started scolding that you are doing lots of damage for us and in Mayadip Islands, because they are extracting sands illegally. So we started a movement to stop them. So these people are, I came to know, he is from the present ruling government parliamentarian, and these people tried to kill me, and several times I was unconscious for some time. I just fell down on the ground. Chris Pinderhughes, the volunteer, and he just informed he went to Shunarga, the mainland, and informed to some of my journalist friends. And these journalist friends, local journalists of Shunarga, they compelled the local administration and the police, and they rescued me.
That's all for this week's Human Rights Asia Weekly Roundup. For more information on these issues, log on to www.humanrights.asia. Thank you for watching and hope to see you again next week.